They called it a relic of rumor, a story folded into the town's margins until someone opened it again. In late 2024, small clusters of calls began to thread through the winter air, farmers speaking in low tones about a figure seen at dusk. A highway camera that, for a single trembling frame, seemed to catch the unforgiving points of light. By spring of 2025, those whispers swelled into a pattern people could no longer ignore. Mara, a local archivist who spent her days cataloging scanned letters and old newspaper clippings, kept the ledger of these claims. She did not want myths, she wanted evidence. Still, the ledger filled with the same careful language, alleged sighting, unverified report, witness describes winged humanoid with red eyes. Each entry read like a prophecy being checked against a calendar. Predictions scribbled in margins decades earlier match dates when strangers swore they had looked up and felt, for an instant, that the world had tilted. The town's older women, who sold pies and remembered every road name, spoke of premonitions, a hard, honest superstition rather than a grab for drama. It returns when the wires hum wrong, one said, tapping the telephone pole outside the diner. Whether that was metaphor or memory, people began to close curtains earlier and leave their dogs inside. On a rain-smeared evening, Mara followed a line of reports to an abandoned quarry. She walked with the recorder and the cool certainty of someone who writes things down so others can judge them later. When the wind rose, it sounded like canvases snapping, larger than a bird, too rhythmic to be machinery. To lights hovered between treetops, not malevolent so much as improbably patient. The recorder caught a long, low tone and then nothing conclusive at all. Back at her desk, Mara typed unexplained and underlined it once. The ledger did not decide the truth, it held only the accumulation of claims. Outside, the town's lights kept their lonely beat, and somewhere beyond them people continued to call, to report, to warn, or to hope that what they saw would finally make sense. Maps shift quietly before people do. What began as pins clustered around Point Pleasant, stories folded into the margins of local papers and the worn backs of coffee shop receipts, started to scatter. At first it was a lonely stray, a photograph from a county sheriff in Ohio, grainy and disputed. Then a fisherman off the Massachusetts coast sent a short shocked video to a local radio station. In the clip a dark shape slid above the waterline, eyes bright as coals, and the reel ended with the engine cutting out. Within months, messages arrived from places no one had expected: a village near a Scottish loch, a highway in rural Oregon, the scrubland outside a small Japanese city. Each report arrived with the same tremor of disbelief. Maya, a cartographer who had spent years plotting folklore against geology, began to notice a pattern. The pins were not random. They traced corridors of infrastructure and night sky corridors where power lines and migratory birds overlapped. World prophecy margins mentioned the wings moving west and oversea. She found, awkwardly, those dates and crude timestamps matched the newest reports. The coincidences were not proof. They were invitations to look harder. Small teams assembled, journalists with thermal cameras, university ornithologists who insisted on ruling out large raptors, and a taciturn radio technician who tracked anomalous electromagnetic noise. Their reports were careful, slow, and, crucially, contradictory. A thermal array in Spain recorded nothing but flocks. A roadside camera in Manitoba captured a shadow that moved with a human gait. Local witnesses described cultural frames for the same phenomenon, sometimes a presage, sometimes a warning, sometimes an animal that would not stay confined to other people's maps. The climax came on a Wednesday night when screens across 3 continents lit up with uncorrelated footage. A commuter camera in Poland froze on a hulking silhouette. A barge operator in the Gulf of Mexico spoke into a recorder about two red pinpoints hovering over a fog bank. A park ranger in Tasmania described the hush that fell before dogs began to panic. None of the feeds were cinematic. They were muddled, human, and maddeningly ambiguous. Scientists circled, hypothesized, and countered. Amateur sleuths compared timestamps until their eyes burned. In the weeks that followed, there was no tidy resolution. Maps acquired a new kind of entry, report unverified. That phrase became its own geography. People in towns far from Point Pleasant adjusted porch lights and watched the skies with a different attention. Whether the spread was natural, mythic, or something else entirely, the effect was the same, a small, persistent rearrangement of the world's edges. The pins kept falling where they fell, and the maps, like the witnesses, waited for someone brave enough to make sense of the space between them. They arrived in the inboxes like small, guilty confessions, shaky phone clips, a single grainy frame from a dashcam, a photograph taken through a diner window at dawn. Each file came with the same, whispered label, 2024 sighting. Over the winter of 2024 to 2025, the files multiplied, not with cinematic clarity, but with the kind of ambiguity that forces people to look twice and then look again. Eli, a forensic photographer who once worked with missing persons teams, grew tired of the word capture when applied to these images. Capture implied control. What he saw in the files was compromise, motion blur folding a wing into a roadside sign, pixels blooming into two amber-like points where eyes should be. He pulled a single frame from a commuter video, a silhouette perched on a distant ridge, and ran it through every enhancement he knew. The shape held and unraveled at the same time. Sharpening produced noise that looked like feathering, while smoothing revealed an outline suspiciously like a person in a coat. A university lab offered a different kind of analysis. An algorithm trained to remove compression artifacts returned multiple plausible originals for the same still, a large raptor, a draped tarp, a contrived fabrication. Probability distributions, the lead researcher said carefully, not certainties. The language of science stretched like glass under pressure, useful, reflective, and prone to fracture. Online, the clips became small battlegrounds. Skeptics pointed to lens flares and hoaxes. Believers traced the footage against old prophecies, noting dates that matched journal margins and handwritten notes. An AI restorer produced a high-contrast rendering that made the arms readable where there had only been suggestions. A retired pilot noticed a flight path in one metadata file that made the shadow S angle plausible. Nothing added up into proof. Everything pushed toward possibility. The climax came when a citizen journalist stitched 5 disparate videos from a bridge camera, a dash cam, a night vision trail cam, a ferry's security feed, and a handheld into a single timeline. For 30 breathless seconds, the feeds overlapped. An object crossing a valley, an array of lights pulsing, dogs barking, a power transformer tripping. The stitched sequence offered rhythm more than detail, movement that suggested intent, not random drift. It ended with a still, 2 glowing points between branches, uncomfortably close to the lens before darkness consumed them. Afterwards, analysts debated frames and filters and motive. No court called it evidence. No paper printed absolution. The files did something quieter and more insistent. They taught a town and a scattered world to disagree without silence, to inspect the blurry edges where certainty erodes. In the ledger of claims, the new files lived as unverified, but unverified does not equal unimportant. Sometimes the shape of a thing, even when indistinct, redraws the lines where people place their fear, their faith, and their need for an answer. They began as phone calls and handwritten notes, voices that sounded formal because the people speaking wanted their words to be taken seriously. Between late 2024 and the spring of 2025, a small archive grew. Recorded interviews, timestamps, and the tired phrase unverified report. Taken together, the testimonies formed a pattern that was less spectacle than strain, a set of repeated details offered by strangers who had no reason to agree. On a fog-thick November night, Tom, a highway trucker hauling feed through rural West Virginia, called the local station. He said he had seen something perched on the bridge like a sentinel. His hands trembled on the recorder as he described a silhouette taller than a man, wings folded like a draped coat, eyes that glowed like embers. He swore the lights on his rig dimmed as it passed. He did not joke. He did not laugh. A week later, near an abandoned quarry outside town, Rosa, a schoolteacher walking her dog, reported a different detail. The thing watched for a long time before it moved, and when it moved it made no sound, the way wind makes no sound when it climbs a ridge. Her spaniel went rigid and whimpered. The creature seemed to pay more attention to the dog than to Rosa. It tilted its head, like it was listening, she said. It knew I was there, and then it left the way a shadow slips under a door. Across state lines, a teenager named Malik captured a phone clip on a back road. He described the fear in his voice on the recording. It flew low across the highway, wings wide. It almost grazed the trees. I thought I saw hands. The clip itself was smeared with motion and sunlight. What shimmered at the crest of a hill could be branches or a figure. Still, Malik asked trembling cadence. The way his laugh cut off and turned to a cough made the footage feel less like evidence than like witness. A park ranger in the Northeast kept a notebook filled with field observations. Dogs barking in patterns not explained by coyotes' compasses that faltered in particular clearings, a persistent low hum recorded on nights when the sky was otherwise empty. He did not use the word monster. He wrote anomalous animal behavior and drew careful, small sketches of wing shapes. The climax of these accounts came one rain-dark evening when 3 independent witnesses, a fisher on a coastal inlet, a woman checking her barn lights, and a late-shift convenience worker, all reported seeing the same pair of red gleams separated by dozens of miles, but described in the same words, 2 coals patient not frantic. Each reported the same aftermath, a hush that settled so complete dogs shook and radios statused out. Skeptics pointed to pareidolia, camera artifacts, and the contagion of rumor. Believers noted that the testimonies converged in sensory detail, posture, silence, the patient eyes, in a way that felt deliberate rather than random. The archive did not answer. It catalogued human perception, the way people remember light, the way fear distorts scale, the stubborn repeat of certain images across separate nights. At the center of the binder sat a single, hand-scrawled note. Look closely at what people say when they might be wrong. It was an instruction and a warning. The testimonies continued to arrive, raw and earnest, insisting that something was there to be witnessed, or that something important had rearranged how people watched. Either way, the town learned to listen. They used to fold the Mothman into folklore the way people fold winter coats into trunks, something kept, remembered, and rarely opened. By early 2025, that lid had been lifted, not by spectacle, but by a slow, braid-like tightening. Sightings, blurry footage, and a string of predictions someone somewhere had written down long ago. The old margins of a pamphlet, a priest's notebook, and a farmer's frantic grocery list scribble began to line up with dates and phrases that read like weather forecasts for human trouble. Mara, the archivist who kept the ledger, found herself cataloging more than descriptions. Alongside each unverified sighting, she started to note concurrent news items. A sudden factory shut down reported 3 counties away. A maritime cable cut that darkened coastal towns for hours. An unusual migration of people across a border that sparked her anxious headlines. It was correlation, she told herself, not causation, but the margins of the ledger filled with parentheses and question marks until the page looked like a prophecy map. People began to speak of omen theory in a new, quieter register. In the diner, a retired meteorologist traced the old notes and suggested the sightings clustered around infrastructural weak points, power lines, bridges, undersea cables, places where small failures could cascade into larger collapse. A pastor argued in the church basement that the figure was a warning, not of a single event, but of a season when the fragile parts of systems would be tested. Omen, she said, is only a word people use when they feel the future compressed and unreadable. Speculation spread beyond the town. Conjectures threaded through late-night forums and satellite chatrooms. The creature preceded outages. It appeared before gatherings of unrest. It hovered where supply chains wobbled. Analysts skeptical, Careful cited selection bias and human pattern seeking. Prophets cited calendars and old margins. The argument was not about proof but about attention. Omens, once believed, changed behavior. The climax arrived not as revelation, but as a day that refused to be ordinary. In a single week, 3 small collapses happened in separate regions. A bridge cable snapped under a freight train, a regional power grid hiccuped and plunged towns into slow dark, and a coastal storm that weather models had misswelled unexpectedly and rerouted shipping. None of these events were apocalyptic. Each was, however, the kind of disruption that multiplied annoyances into emergencies. In the ledger, a new entry read simply, preceded by sighting to 7 days prior. Afterwards, people argued with the same old friction. Some called the alignment coincidence. Some called it a useful superstition. Businesses lit redundant generators. Parents taught children to pack bags for short evacuations. Local councils reviewed maintenance schedules. The figure in the stories did not promise disaster, though much as insist on attention. A ledger line demanding maintenance. An old margin asking that fragile things be cared for. Whether omen, warning, or communal anxiety given shape, the effect was unambiguous. The town watched the edges of its map more closely. In the quiet that followed, Mara underlined one word and left it there. Prepare. It was modest, unheroic, and human, a final note that felt, if nothing else, like a reasonable response to a world that sometimes speaks in shadows. The Mothman lived in margins, a rumor folded into memories, a shadow in roadside lore. In 2024 to 2025, that margin widened until the creature could no longer be contained as local folklore. Social media did what it does. It amplified and repackaged. A shaky clip from a night watch group became a viral thread. A grainy photograph from a farmer was remixed into thousands of thumbnails. Each share altered the image, and the figure began to exist in many small variants. Lena, a cultural historian, tracked hashtags and archived comments. Modern myth-making, she knew, is a chorus, not a single storyteller. People added layers, memes that mocked fear, threads that annotated sightings with timestamps and weather, podcasts that treated marginalia like evidence. Podcasters reached global audiences, turning local margins into international dossiers. Each iteration shifted expectations, sometimes toward parody, sometimes toward solemn analysis. The legend bent to contemporary anxieties, older tales leaned on prophecy. New ones folded in infrastructure failures, climate stress, and political unease. Red eyes became a thumbnail trigger, bridge images paired with eyewitness accounts. Archival notes gained relevance when matched to maintenance logs. Artists reimagined the silhouette, short films gave motion to static frames. The creature became a metaphor as much as a monster. There were tensions. Skeptics cited hoaxes and confirmation bias. Scientists urged caution. Platforms favored volume and velocity over verdicts. A single ambiguous clip birthed 1,000 theories before any lab could analyze the file. Communities curated evidence streams. One mapped sightings against grid incidents. Another compared reports to bird migrations. The result was not clarity, but a dense lattice of possibility. The climax arrived as civic response. A town board meeting to review bridge upkeep filled with residents citing viral threads and time-stamped videos. An influencer who chased clicks hosted an engineer. A meme maker posted a sober thread linking old reports to recent logs. Briefly, the online chorus turned into organized attention, arguing, demanding inspections, and volunteering for night watches. The Mothman's persistence says less about proving a creature and more about how we cope with uncertainty. The legend endures because platforms accelerate narrative change and communities turn fear into shared stories. In that restless space between curiosity and dread, the myth grows, not truer, perhaps, but more public, and therefore harder to ignore. Skepticism had its own voice in the ledger, not loud, but steady, the small type that insists on margins and footnotes. As 2024 blurred into 2025, the town's collection of sighting reports swelled, and with it came the familiar friction. Believers who heard pattern in the hush, and doubters who heard only noise. Eli, the forensic photographer, kept a separate folder labeled controls. For every shaky clip sent by a trembling witness, he placed a known false positive, a gull caught in low light, a delivery drone rounding a tree line, a hooded figure on a windy night. He could reproduce the exact bloom of pixels that made a wing look like a coat, or the glint that masqueraded as an ember. Most of what looks uncanny is explainable, he told a local reporter, and his voice had the careful bluntness of someone who knew how easy it is to be convinced by a frame out of context. Yet the town's binder contained things the controls did not fully account for. Multiple witnesses, people who had no online audience and no reason to collude, described the same patient stare, the same quiet that fell before dogs cowered. Videos carried metadata stripped by apps and compression, timestamps rounded, GPS scrubbed. Each attempt to verify a clip then became an exercise in what had been lost: original resolution, device logs, camera angles. Even thermal signatures could be read two ways. A heat map might be a foul or a person wrapped in tarpaulin, depending on algorithm and calibration. At the climax, a public screening was organized. The town hall filled with lantern faces and skeptical frames, an ornithologist, a drone hobbyist, a software analyst, a woman who had swore she'd seen it perched on a bridge. They watched 5 videos back to back. The ornithologist pointed out wing beat patterns consistent with large raptors. The drone hobbyist demonstrated how LED configurations could mimic glowing eyes. The analyst showed how RGB compression produced phantom contours. The woman, when asked if any of those explanations matched her night, said quietly that nothing did, and that what she remembered was not a video, a fact, but a lived moment that had rearranged her sense of scale. Afterwards, the room split into small debates that hummed late into the night. Some left convinced the phenomena were misidentifications and manufactured clips. Others left convinced of something unresolved. A graduate student published a careful paper that rated each piece of evidence on verifiability. Most entries scored low. A community group proposed a checklist for future reports: original files, witness statements recorded immediately, tripod-mounted cameras at key sites. These were mundane, practical measures, the tools of skepticism given a civic life. The ledger remained open. Skepticism did not extinguish curiosity. Instead, it sharpened it, turning rumor into inquiry and fear into protocols. Whatever the truth, bird, drone, trick, or something not yet named, the town learned to demand both rigor and patience. In the end, the mystery persisted not because evidence was absent, but because human testimony and technical forensics braided together in ways that refused to be tidy. The Mothman has become less a single story than a living knot in America's cultural fabric, adaptable, stubborn, and oddly domestic. Where once the figure belonged to hush and pie conversations at diner counters, it now moves through feeds and festival tents, sermon and symposium with the same sly persistence. It wears many faces: a cautionary silhouette on a roadside magnet, a meme that winks at midnight, a serious topic at a university seminar on folklore. Each reinvention keeps the core image: wings, ember eyes, the feeling of being watched, while letting communities shape what it means to them. In small towns, fundraisers and museum exhibits tuck the creature into local identity. In cities, filmmakers and podcasters retell it as allegory for unease. Teenagers stitch it into cosplay. Elders frame old clippings with a kind of affectionate incredulity. The legend flexes to fit whatever whirring the moment supplies: infrastructure and isolation, the speed of information, the sense that systems might fail when we least expect it, and in doing so it remains usable, not inert. The climax of its latest turn arrived at a night market where a lecture on pattern seeking rubbed shoulders with a booth selling handcrafted moth pins. People queued for samplers and stories alike. A folklorist recounted margins of ledgered sightings. A mechanic spoke of maintenance checks begun after a viral clip. A teenager read a poem that made the creature seem more like grief's shadow than a monster. When a brief power flicker have the stalls in darkness, conversations hushed, laughter and fear braided together. No winged thing materialized, nothing cinematic, but the pause itself felt like the legend's final proof that myth can command attention long after proof is demanded. What endures is not the certainty of an encounter, but the Mothman-esque capacity to hold a society's anxieties and amusements in one fragile frame. It survives because people keep telling it, reshaping it until the shadow fits new rooms.